restart our recording here as people kind of come in, but let's just get started. All right. Welcome everyone who's coming in and joining us. We're so happy to have you here. Welcome to Green Drinks. My name is Ginevra. I'm the program coordinator at Sustainable Woodstock. We are hosting this event. Specifically, our Forest Carbon Action Group is hosting this event, so welcome. Sustainable Woodstock is a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 2009. Our mission is to inspire, educate, and empower everyone to live environmentally, economically, and socially responsible lives. So you have come to one of our Green Drinks events. They are social events that happen monthly, typically in person, but right now we are obviously virtual. We're hoping to connect people with similar interests related to climate and sustainability. So we invite local businesses, nonprofits, individuals to come make short presentations that highlight their sustainability and green initiatives that are kind of happening in our region. So this is our April event. They happen every third Thursday of the month. So you can always check out our website for the next one, but I'm going to do a brief plug and just say that our May Green Drinks will be on May 20th at 5:30, and it will be with Andrew Winter from Twin Pines Housing and Jill Davies from the Woodstock Community Trust. And the topic is housing in the Upper Valley. So a pretty hot topic right now, especially given the COVID housing boom. So we're going to be talking about moderate income and like low income, moderate income, affordable housing. And these are both really experienced people on this topic. So really excited for that. Hope you'll join us. I'll send out a follow-up email from this event with info from this presentation and a link to that to sign up. So before we do get started and hear from Ali, I just wanted to run through the agenda and how the meeting will operate. You're being recorded right now. Well, the meeting is being recorded, and we are also on Facebook Live. So if anyone is watching this on Facebook Live, please type any questions you have in the chat. And for everyone on Zoom, any questions you have can go in the chat box. If you're not familiar with Zoom, that's in the bottom. There's a little bubble. It'll say chat. You can type your question in there. You're currently muted, so we'll do our questions that way. And then myself and Michael, our director, will ask them of Ali during the Q&A section. So after she's presented. Other than that, we will follow up with contact info and a link to the recording of this presentation if you're hoping to share it with anybody or rewatch after. So I'm going to have Tim Stout now, one of our great Forest Carbon Action Group leaders, introduce Ali, our speaker.
Great. I don't know if you can all see me, Ginevra.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Great. I must have the wrong screen. Anyway, good evening all. It's a treat to have you all join us, and a huge thanks to Michael Caduto and Ginevra for hosting this. I am a longtime Vermonter, but have lived out of the state periodically. And about 3 years ago, my background was in energy efficiency, renewable energy, climate change. I attended a presentation by Dr. William Keaton from UVM, who's one of the outstanding leaders on carbon, and realized that this is a whole different way. Forest carbon is a whole different way that we can look at the forests that we have in the state, whether they're ones we own or whether they're state lands or federal lands. There's a huge amount of carbon in our forests, and we can make a very positive impact on the amount that's stored and sequestered in our forests. And that's what Ali will be talking about. So I created a small, my passion through the organization I created called North End Forest Carbon is how we bring this to the smaller landowner. So if you've got thousands of acres, you're all set to participate in carbon markets. But if you're a little landowner, it may, or a smaller landowner, it may be a challenge. And so my passion is, with all the thousands of small landowners we have in Vermont, how can we help them participate in programs for forest carbon? How can we help them manage their land to store and sequester carbon? And it turns out there's a lot that we can do. A huge amount of research has happened in the last 3 years. And certainly prior to that. It's very exciting to have all of you on the call. Ali knows this field extremely well. She's been instrumental in helping me get up to speed on it, and extremely patient as I ask the most minuscule questions. So she knows this field through and through. And I will now introduce Ali. She's a climate forester, and I say that with great pride because it's very inspiring to have in Vermont our own climate forester, someone who looks at that connection between our climate and the impacts on our forests. She's with the Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation, where she works to better understand and manage forests under climate change. Her background is in forest ecophysiology, which means that she considers how trees respond to environmental change and how those changes impact the larger forest ecosystem. She lives in the foothills of the Green Mountains in Bolton, where she can be found wandering in the woods, hopefully, Ali, not aimlessly, but studying her beloved trees. So I will now turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me, and everyone, thanks for showing up today. Although for most of us here in Vermont, we wouldn't be outside right now because it's not not as lovely as it has been. So yes, as Tim said, I am the climate forester for the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, and I will say with pride is the first climate forester in the United States. This is a really important position. Other states are recognizing this too, but we're leading the way in thinking about this. So. Going to be talking about forest carbon specifically for landowners. I'm trying to synthesize the complexity that there is in this topic and hopefully hit that, but I will leave time at the end for questions, as I'm sure there will be some. All right, so why we're talking about forest carbon in forests is because trees and forests help us mitigate the effects of climate change by taking in carbon dioxide from the air, and they store that carbon in wood and eventually in soils and forests. And in fact, about half of the dry weight of a tree, of the wood in a tree, is carbon that was taken out of the atmosphere. And that's an incredible amount of carbon and efficiency. We couldn't build anything better. You know, it's really incredible what a tree can do. And all plants take in carbon from the atmosphere for photosynthesis, but trees are really unique in that they have evolved this woody perennial stem, allowed them to get taller, outcompete their other plants that didn't develop that stem. But really, that's every time this tree grows in a three-dimensional nature, you can see with these rings, adding more wood, which is more carbon. So I'm going to start with some big picture take-home messages. Hopefully, if you remember nothing, that this is what settles in and what you can expect in the rest of this talk. So first, to help mitigate climate change, not only do we need to reduce our own anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but finding ways to take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it for a long time, right? So forests can help us do this. They naturally do that. But I do want to convey that forest carbon cycles are really complex. There's a lot of things and factors that influence them. And also on top of this is that forests themselves are threatened by climate change. So we can use forests to mitigate the effects of climate change, but at the same time, we need to consider how forests will be impacted, because that affects how well they do with mitigating climate change through sequestering carbon. And also, I do want to convey that we can make choices and how we manage, how we think about forests to maintain or even increase forest carbon. But really, that forest resilience is critical into the future. If we don't have a healthy, productive forest, we won't have any carbon sequestration. So I just want to do some terminology, because I recognize that this is complex. There's a lot of terms. It's new for a lot of people. And there's some confusion in some of these terms. And so just kind of getting that out at the front so everyone's on the same page here. So carbon versus carbon dioxide, you'll probably hear me say carbon most of the time when really it's interchangeable. And why this is because trees are taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but they're breaking apart that molecule. They're using the carbon, releasing the oxygen. So the carbon is really what gets stored. It's made into wood. So lignin and cellulose that makes up wood has a lot of carbon in it. But that carbon is eventually released. It's not permanently stored forever and ever in a tree. When that tree dies or is burnt or a part breaks off, it can be decomposed. There's respiration that happens in a forest. This happens in every living organism. Metabolic processes break down food, sugar, and carbon dioxide is released. You could have a forest fire. And in all those situations, often that carbon will rejoin oxygen and make CO2. So CO2 gets released back out. So it's really much easier for us to just convert everything into the same units. Carbon dioxide equivalent is what we call. And this really helps us, because if we want to use forests to offset some of our greenhouse gas emissions, it helps us to have the same units. So what this can look like, for example, so here the average, we have a little schematic here. So this is what a metric ton of carbon dioxide is actually a pretty big amount, because a gas is diffuse. So if you can visualize a cube that's 27 feet on all sides. So that's what a metric ton of carbon dioxide would look like. So the average Vermonter emits about 15.5 metric tons. It's a little bit more than a US ton of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. And so this helps us compare, because we know that an average acre of Vermont forest takes in, sequesters about 1.3 metric tons a year. And so that helps us kind of compare apples to apples in a way. Instead of carbon to carbon dioxide equivalent, we have the same units. And this means that we in Vermont would need 12 acres of forest to offset a single Vermonter's emissions. Just to put that into context, a car, you see here, is about 4.75 metric tons a year. So some other terms that get confused a lot, sequestration and storage in particular. Carbon storage is the total amount of carbon in an entity. So in a tree, in an acre of forest, in an acre of soil, in the entire Vermont forest. Whereas carbon sequestration is the rate at which the carbon dioxide is taken out of the atmosphere and stored. Carbon emissions, opposite of that, the rate at which the carbon is released back to the atmosphere. And so the combination of those two, carbon dioxide and carbon emissions, is often called carbon flux. That's just a change in the amount of carbon stored. So if you have more carbon sequestration, you have an increase in the carbon stored. If you have more carbon emissions, you have a decrease in the amount of carbon stored. And I'll show you how that works, but it's also really important to recognize that carbon is not static in a forest. It is constantly moving, constantly cycling through the forest. It is not permanently stored in any part. There's different time frames that can be stored, from hours or maybe minutes even to millennia in soils, but any timeline in between. So trees, as I mentioned, they're taking in this carbon dioxide, storing in the wood, and the carbon from the trees gets cycled to other parts of the forest, used by other organisms, used to build their bodies, grow bigger, for energy. But eventually this carbon does get emitted back out to the atmosphere, and the cycle begins again, or is constantly cycling. And when we look a little bit in more detail at what this looks like in the forest, we actually can divide the carbon into what we call pools. And so we can have what we've labeled, and sometimes there's not distinct lines always between all of these pools, but we have the live trees, dead trees, downed wood, soil, and the leaf litter layer. And you can see on all of these, there's cycling between all of the pools indicated here in blue dashed line, right? So carbon goes from the live trees, maybe a tree dies, goes to down wood, eventually ends up in the soil. But at each one of these steps, there is some carbon emissions through respiration, through decomposition that happens. So the amount of carbon coming into live trees is never going to be the same amount that makes it all the way to the soil, because there's going to be some that gets lost back to the atmosphere. Soils store more than half of the carbon in our forests here in Vermont. So it's pretty significant, but they're fairly slow. They're not very dynamic. So they are fairly consistent in the amount they store. It takes a long time for carbon from these other pools to make it here and for that carbon to get secured in that soil. I did mention though that there is evidence that carbon can get locked into soils for centuries and even millennia. Some of the carbon doesn't stay that long in the soil, and it will be processed by microbes and earthworms and insects. And some of the carbon gets leached out into the waterway too. So that's a really natural thing that can happen. In managed forests, there's also another carbon pool that we have in harvested wood products. So the carbon that is taken out of the forest as harvested wood remains in that wood for as long as that wood is in use. So that can range from a piece of paper, which would have a short timeline of being stored, to floorboards or building material for structural building material, wood that ends up as furniture. Right? We know here in Vermont, New England, we can have houses that are many hundreds of years old, and that's carbon stored for that long. Pretty impressive. There is also emissions from harvested wood as that wood decomposes in landfill or is burnt. We use a lot of our harvested wood for bioenergy too, and so that releases emissions as well. So because of this kind of trade-off, we have this balance between carbon sequestration and carbon emissions that affects the ability of the forest to mitigate climate change, to take in carbon dioxide. So we need more carbon sequestration than emissions to have a net increase in storage. However, there are a lot of factors that affect both of these processes. So climate, how much moisture, what's the temperature? What's the site condition like? Has there been disturbance at the site? What is the nutrient status like in the soil? And then the individual tree factors, species, genetics, how that tree is responding to stress. So this is a really important balance to think about. It's not that every forest we have is going to have net sequestration. In fact, we know that there are many instances where we have forests that are sources of carbon. So a carbon sink is when that sequestration is greater than emissions, and a carbon source is when emissions are greater than sequestration. And a lot of these instances are transient, right? So we have here in the left a windstorm that knocked down trees. So those trees are no longer actively taking in carbon dioxide from the air, and they're also decomposing. So there's going to be an increase in emissions in that case. But you know, that's a huge gap in the forest. New seedlings, new saplings will take over. There'll be vigorous growth. And in not that long, maybe a decade, there will be a net sequestration, and maybe even shorter, depending on the forest condition. We can have things like in the middle photo, we can have defoliation events. This is maple leaf cutter. We had fairly severe maple leaf cutter here last year. It's native. But you can imagine if, you know, the whole photosynthetic part of a tree, the leaf, is defoliated and eaten, the tree cannot take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere anymore. But yet that tree is still needs to use energy, so the tree will use stored carbon that it has and still release carbon dioxide through respiration. So you can have situations where there are greater emissions and sequestration. And then also there's anthropogenic reasons, right? So timber harvesting takes wood out of the forest. That's a decrease in wood, decrease in the live tree ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. And there may be more decomposition afterwards if there's a lot of debris left. There could be, there could be damage to roads that causes churning of the soil, which can release carbon. But again, this is very transient. As soon as the new trees have a chance to grow up in that situation, in that condition, there'll be rapid growth, rapid sequestration. And so in all these cases, it's usually a transient decline in sequestration, a transient increase in emissions. But it's also important to recognize that carbon dynamics really do depend on what scale we're talking about, both spatial and temporal. So we could have a situation where we have a stand on the left, and maybe the carbon dynamics look like this over time. So we might have quite a lot of fluctuation. Perhaps there's this first dip, there is a timber harvest, or maybe a natural disturbance that happens. And then we have growth that increases. Well, maybe we have a drought or an insect outbreak that lowers that carbon, that forest carbon. And then we have, well, if we look at multiple stands over the landscape, that variability over time and space really evens out. So it's often important to think about the full landscape scale when we think about carbon, especially for these transient declines in carbon sequestration from natural disturbance events or insect outbreaks. We look at Vermont's forests. We are very lucky here. We have 4.5 million acres of forests. I think I calculated it was like, FIA says about 3.8 billion trees. So we're very lucky here. Got a lot of trees and a lot of forests. And our forests here are a net carbon sink. So every year we accrue more and more carbon in our forests as our forests grow. And this is the top figure, the top graph here. And these numbers are quite huge. This is 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So really that where we are here in 2019 is almost 1.8 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's a huge amount. To put that into context, because that's probably meaningless to a lot of people, if we somehow released all that carbon that was stored in our forests, it would be 200 times our annual state emissions. That's huge. So we have a lot of carbon stored in our forests. And every year we're accruing more. So we're sequestering more at a rate of about 5.8 million metric tons a year. And that looks fairly steady over time from 1990 to 2019. But in this bottom figure, if we look actually at the annual sequestration rate, you can see that it's not steady over time. There's been some fluctuations. And in 1990, we were sequestering our forests, the royal we, our forests were sequestering about 6 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. And now, in the most recent year of data, 2018, they're only sequestering 5.2 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that the amount that they're taking in and storing has decreased over time. And why is this? Why are we seeing a decrease? Well, it's likely due to a number of reasons, but the most likely reason is because of the recovery of our forests following land clearing. So as many of you are probably aware, Vermont was nearly fully cleared of its forests for farm and pasture land, and then was allowed to regrow just really naturally as the forest saw fit. This means that a lot of our forests are very similar age bracket. And that means we don't have a lot of age diversity across our landscape. We also have lost forest land over time. And every time we lose forest, we not only lose that stored carbon, we lose that future sequestration. So we kind of chip away at our forest sink. There is also evidence that climate change is causing accelerated decomposition. So this can mean that dead wood on the ground or soils, the carbon in those pools can break apart and cycle more quickly. There also have been changes in forest management over this time, which are also a little bit hard to disentangle from this effect. And so what this looks like when we talk about age and sequestration storage is that we see that over the age of a forest, the storage and sequestration peak at different times. So if we look at the right image first, so this is carbon flux, where we have negative numbers are sequestration, positive numbers are emissions. And this is for a maple beech birch forest. And you can see that the age is on the bottom here. And if you look at this dotted black line, that's the total carbon in this forest. There's different pools shown, live trees, forest floor, dead wood, and soil. But this dotted line shows that this forest peaks in its sequestration, so its ability to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year at about 15 to 20 years of age. And then there's, a fairly slow decline in that rate over time. Conversely, if we go over to carbon storage on the left image, same setup here, although you have carbon storage, but with forest age. And you can see again, dotted black line, total carbon just really increases as that stand gets older. When we look at what our forest age is, and again, this is a little bit of a simplification because this is a maple beech birch forest and we don't have just maple beech birch forest, but just for it to illustrate, most of our forests are in this 50 to 100 year age range. And that's where we are with storage and sequestration. And you see that if we bump over in 25 years, we will have more storage, but our sequestration rate will likely go down. And this is bearing any other changes in our forest management, disturbances, just to illustrate how sequestration could decrease as our forests age. It's also important to recognize that forests can follow many trajectories. This is a work from Bill Keaton, who Tim Stout mentioned in the beginning, certainly the carbon expert in the state. And he's shown that there are a lot of different ways that carbon accrues in a forest, and it might not be the same for every type. And it really depends on a lot of factors. Disturbances are a big one. So was there a windstorm, insect outbreak, microburst, drought, all sorts of events that can reduce the carbon stored in a forest and reduce the future sequestration. So when we talk about how to manage forests to help us with climate change, we actually have two different ways to think about this. And it seems like they're the same, but it's kind of two sides of the same coin. So one option is we can enhance the forest carbon sink. So this is just increasing carbon storage, through active sequestration. But also we can do a lot with forests by reducing sources of emissions. And this is really important about avoid emitting additional CO2 to the atmosphere. This one is harder to measure though. It's really challenging to quantify and figure out how much carbon are you not emitting to the atmosphere. But it's incredibly important and forests can play a big part in this. So examples of the first one, enhancing the forest carbon sink rate. So planting trees, that's a great, very clear example. There was no tree there, you plant a tree, that tree grows actively, taking in carbon from the atmosphere, storing it in its wood and its roots, cycling it to the soil. But we can also do things like using ecological silviculture in our forests to enhance tree growth. We can harvest and make durable wood products, as I mentioned, that are long-term storage of carbon. So as far as avoiding emissions, things like avoiding land use change and deforestation, substituting wood products for higher emissions products. So this is a really interesting and growing area of science investigation, is how we can use wood products to offset emissions from fossil fuel intensive products. And then also really simple things like minimizing soil erosion. When soils erode, that is carbon that is getting left, carbon that is leaving the system, especially if it goes into waterways, it becomes dissolved. That is carbon that is getting leached out of the soil system. So using wood as a substitute for fossil fuels, like I said, is a really interesting growing area of interest. And what's really cool about this is that when we do this, when we use wood products to substitute for fossil fuel intensive materials, we get a permanent and cumulative reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, which is pretty neat if you think about it. So a couple ways we can do this. So example, sawn wood has 2 different climate benefits. I love this wood parking garage. I think it's from Denmark. I think that's so beautiful compared to our concrete parking garages that we have here. So we can have long-term storage. So as long as this parking garage is in use, it is storing carbon in that wood, but also this parking garage meant that concrete wasn't used, maybe less steel. We have a really great ability to use wood now in ways that we didn't in the past, that can be used for large buildings, industrial buildings. And then also we get an added benefit that often the wood can be reclaimed from these projects when it is at end of life and used for a biofuel. So we then can offset uses of fossil fuel for heat or energy. And so biofuels are another way. We don't get any storage benefit, right? Because they're, somewhat immediately released back to the atmosphere when they're burned. So that carbon dioxide is released back in the atmosphere. But when it means we're not using fossil fuels, that's an incredibly powerful benefit. So it depends what that biofuel is being substituted for. Coal is a much bigger benefit than natural gas, for example. But you can see in this figure to the right, this is a schematic to show 2 different options. It was a study to look at options for these combined mitigation effects from harvested sites. And in this bottom figure with the highest combination, it was a combination of things that gave the highest mitigation effect. But you can see in the back image here with the horizontal lines, this is the substitution effect. And for this example, you can see that that's much higher, an incredible amount of emissions that were avoided in this scenario. And here you have in the hatched, you have the tree biomass. And each time this forest was cut at 7-year cycles, and the wood products were used for different uses. So you can get some significant benefits this way. I will say this, as I mentioned, this is a very growing area of science, and we're learning a lot about these dynamics, and we will continue to learn more. And this has actually been shown for Vermont. We had some modeling done for us by the Forest Service and show that there are multiple ways that we could manage our forests differently to get bigger mitigation effects. So how this graph works is we have hypothetical, future years here, and we have a cumulative mitigation effect that does include substitution effects from products, long-term storage. 0 is, where we are now, is business as usual. So anything above 0, which are these 2 short rotations. So short rotation is bioenergy, or just a short rotation. And short rotation just means they went into the forest and harvested at a shorter duration than they would have normally. So maybe if in this forest management plan, you go in every 50 years, they went in 30 years, so it's a shorter time step you're going in between harvests. And both of those increased emissions relative to baseline. So we don't want to do shorter rotations, but we have a lot of options for increasing sequestration relative to baseline. So longer rotations, reducing deforestation, which makes sense, reducing forest loss, but actually increasing bioenergy was a cumulative mitigation effect. The bottom one is increasing LLP, which is long-lived products. So those are sawn wood that we can use for building or furniture. And then this portfolio was a really great option. That's kind of a combination of everything, which really is probably going to be realistic. And that was really promising that that's almost as high as the top contender. So those are some really important ways that we can have a really clear mitigation effect. And the units here, million metric tons, that's the same units I said that our total sequestration of the state's forests is about 5.2 million metric tons. So you can see that this could be a really effective way to get some extra mitigation. All right, so how can a landowner increase forest carbon on their land? There are a number of ways to think about. So really, keeping your forests as forests. Every acre that we lose to development, stored carbon is emitted, future sequestration potential is lost. And land prices here are expensive, and development is a big pressure. But that is really important that we try to maintain our forests as much as possible. When we lose our forests and return them to forests, it takes decades to centuries to get them to a pre-development state. Like I said, soils take a very long time to recuperate. And so the best pathway here is to keep them as forests. Again, another thing is just minimizing stressors. So we reduce the potential carbon losses that we might see through insect or disease outbreaks. Invasive plants provide a lot of competition to small trees, seedlings. Animal browse is a big impact on trees, particularly the small ones. Another option is to increase stocking where it is lacking. So that's increasing the number of trees, whether you do this by natural regeneration or by planting. A lot of our riparian areas, degraded farmland, other places like that could really benefit from some additional trees. Another option here is lengthening rotations, as I mentioned. Increasing structure. So this is, the messiness of the forest, increasing down wood, dead trees, trees of different sizes. So Bill Keaton calls this structural complexity enhancement, but having trees of different sizes and different status in the forest increases carbon, is good for carbon. And promoting regeneration, we want to make sure we have a future forest, and so we have future carbon mitigation. Increasing diversity, similar to increasing structure, increasing the number of species on forest plot is a really good solution to maintaining carbon. This is sort of like an insurance policy too. If you have a certain pest or pathogen that impacts one species, you have something else there in case of issues. Protecting soil and water. So we want to minimize impacts to soil like erosion and compaction, control where water flows, stop it, spread it, let it seep in. And then, as I mentioned, increasing, if you can work with your forester, or if you do the work and you want to harvest, increasing the proportion of durable wood products. And as you do harvest, it allows for vigorous growth from the remaining trees. So harvesting can be a really great way to select vigorous trees and productive trees, and use the others for other purposes, like harvested wood products for bioenergy, to replace fossil fuel intensive products, to replace fossil fuels themselves. So these have some great climate benefits. So how does forest management itself affect carbon? Well, harvests remove carbon from the forest. So that's, wood is carbon, wood is removed from the forest. That is a loss of carbon from the forest. However, we know that from research, soils may not be impacted too much except by equipment. So it really depends on the equipment used and the time of year of the harvest. But It's really variable if soils are impacted by harvest. Sometimes carbon will actually increase in soils following a harvest, like in this photo here, where a lot of slash is left. That slash decomposes and is added to the, some of it makes its way into the soil carbon pool. And management can cycle carbon to other pools, example with the deadwood. It can result in more rapid carbon sequestration when there's space for these young trees, young vigorous trees to grow up. Again, it provides a diversity of age classes and structure as well to your forest. And like I mentioned, there's just really high variability. Folks want to know, is it, what size gap is good for carbon? It's really depends so much on the system you're using, the equipment, the aspect of your forest, the soils, the time of year, the retention. So it's really incredibly variable. Carbon is hard to measure. I will say that as well, especially soil carbon, and it's variable across a small space. So we, taking big, generalizations, I think is good unless you're in a carbon market where you really need to measure the specific amount of carbon that is being sequestered. So speaking of carbon markets, I'm going to mention a few of them, but so I know there's a lot of interest in selling carbon, forest carbon. There are a lot of available programs now for Vermonters. And as was mentioned at the beginning, we often need a really big land holding to be eligible for a carbon market. It's really because it's really intensive to quantify the carbon. That's really where it comes from. So the costs meant that you just need an economy of scale. You need a large parcel. This is changing. There's a lot of interest from smaller family forest owners. Folks, most of our Vermont parcels or Vermont woodlots are smaller than a few thousand acres. And so that had meant that a lot of Vermonters were pushed out of the carbon market realm, but that is changing. I guess Tim might be able to speak well to Forest Carbon Works as he's maybe entering that, but that is one option that's developing in the region, and they have some really cool technology that they're using to rapidly quantify carbon. There's also Finite Carbon has this new core carbon program. Again, this is not open yet for enrollment. They say that it will be soon. You can have a minimum of 40 acres. Sylvia Terra has a new program that is not available here either. It's currently only in the southern United States for plantations, and it's a very different model for carbon markets, but that's something that might come up here. And then there's a family forest carbon program. This is I think a very good fit for a lot of Vermont landowners, especially on the smaller side. It's a pay for practice program, and this will be piloted very soon here in Vermont. The Nature Conservancy oversees this program, and they are going to be starting to pilot this in southern to central Vermont, a little bit in New York and western Massachusetts. But just in general, I know lots of folks are interested in carbon markets. They are complex, and they may not be right for every landowner right now, but stay tuned because I think there are going to be other options. And there might be a lot of options that differ from the ones that are currently listed here in the future. I know the Biden administration is looking into options to finance carbon sequestration. But let's say, thinking about forest carbon, is it right for you? So it's really great that it can provide a revenue in addition or instead of a timber harvest. So you can layer it on top of other sources of revenue like timber, but you don't have to. Some programs put a long-term contract in the land, and that's probably one of the biggest, most important uses of carbon offset programs is that they secure the land for the length of the contract, which can be lengthy, it can be 40 years or 125 years. And there's usually no upfront costs to the landowner. I would say the drawbacks are that they're complex and can take a lot of time to develop. And again, they may not be available to your landowner size. And there's also consideration about what the actual atmospheric reduction is. What does the atmosphere see? And so really thinking about if this is something, if you thinking about if this is right for you as a landowner, one of the things is entering a carbon offset project giving you a chance to make a really big change on your forest that you wouldn't have done otherwise. And that's a really big carbon saving. If you're managing differently than you would have otherwise, that is great. And the entity buying the offsets, are they reducing their emissions? It's a little bit harder to verify, but that's important. Or is the carbon project saving the land from an imminent threat or a threat in the future, right? So that's really important that these carbon contracts are protecting this land. So thinking about whether it's right for you, you can have all these carbon benefits and not be in a carbon market, right? You just having forest and having it be healthy and productive is providing an incredible carbon and climate benefit. And so it's whether you want to monetize that carbon, that gets into a different question. So I will say this is, one of the things I want to stress is that managing solely for carbon does not necessarily mean that forest stand will have greater resilience to climate change. So here, resilience, I'm talking about the capacity of forests to withstand and recover from climatic events, trends, and disruptions. And so we can actually use adaptation forestry and adaptation management to help these forests reduce their vulnerability, but advance their resilience. And so this is really important considering what a specific forest looks like. If it's had history of land use management that has degraded it, if there are invasive species, if there's a lack of structural or species diversity, doing some management on that parcel to increase its resilience and reduce vulnerability is really going to be the way you can have the biggest climate mitigation effect, right? Because we want that forest to be productive, healthy in the future under a changing climate so that it continues to sequester carbon from the atmosphere, right? So looking back at this that I showed earlier, right? So if we have a situation where we have climatic events that are affecting this balance between sequestration and emissions, we could tip ourselves over the edge of increasing carbon emissions. And trees are really vulnerable to a great many stresses. This is some thinking about a way the tree can suffer declines. Mannion's tree decline concept, this came out in 1981, and I love this concept so much. And it's really important to think about it. It's very rare that one thing kills a tree. It's usually multiple things kill a tree. And so we can have these interacting factors that slowly degrade a tree, cause decline, and can lead to mortality. And one of these things is climate change. So this can be what we call these predisposing factors. It can be, they might not be noticeable. We might not see a change in vigor in the tree or in the forest. It's really hard to detect. It's kind of like, it's a character of the environment that forest is in. But it makes it stressed out of its, what it's used to, its adaptive potential. If we have climate change that is really extreme and stresses a tree, and then it makes it the tree or the forest more vulnerable to these other factors. So we can have insects, we can have climate related events like drought, right? So if a tree is already stressed and then a drought occurs, that tree could push that tree over the edge. And we also have contributing factors that can come in like wood rots and different diseases. And forests have a lot more benefits to the climate than just carbon too, is important to recognize. I'm really glad that we have a focus on carbon, and it's super important. There's a lot of other ecosystem services that forests provide us that do have a direct climate benefit or indirect climate benefit. So for example, trees and forests moderate temperature swings. So you probably have experienced this on a hot day in a city, something like that. Under the shade of a tree, it is much cooler. So trees not only physically shade, but actually through the way that they cycle water, actually reduces temperature extremes. And so this happens in cold and warm temperatures. They prevent soil erosion through their roots and cycling of water, regulating water. They can intercept air pollution, protect the built environment from extreme weather events, and they have been shown to bolster human health. So there's a lot of benefits from forests, and it's great that we can capitalize on all of those things with ecological silviculture, or managing our forests in a sustainable way. So I'm going to propose that all of these strategies that I gave for forest carbon actually can be used for increasing forest resilience. And so we kind of get a twofer. If we increase forest resilience, we are likely to then have a climate benefit through mitigation. So all of these factors that I mentioned have this great climate benefit by mitigating carbon dioxide, increased durable wood products, and increased substitution have less of a forest resilience tie, but there is a really important tie to community and economic resilience. So it's really important that we have a local sustainable source of wood products and energy sources. We're not sort of pushing some of those impacts off onto other places that we can't see, right? So we're very lucky here. I love working with wood. I've had the luxury to be able to do that, to fell a tree and mill it up into boards. And wood is one of the most amazing products, and we grow great, wonderful wood here. And so having a local source of that really allows us to have a community and economic resilience that we may not otherwise have. So I just wanted to end a few slides on some resources, because as I mentioned, this is really a growing area of interest in forest carbon and how forests can help us with climate change in general. If you did not see it, it was just last week, I believe, but Bill Keaton and John Gunn gave a really great overview of the science of forest carbon. It's a little bit more technical, I would say, than this talk, but I thought it was an excellent explainer of some of the controversy or some of the misunderstanding and how we think about forest carbon. Mark Anderson gave a talk on wild carbon, which is on forests that are no-touch, wilderness areas, which was really fascinating as well. And there's a lot of carbon resources out there that are growing. So it's a growing area of interest. A lot of you may know about this Catanzaro and D'Amato forest carbon pamphlet, which is really nice. The U.S. Forest Service has some resources, and Michigan State in particular, they have a forest carbon and climate program, and they have webinars and resources on there, which is really great. And I will make a plug for, I have been revamping the FPR website, actually a new section as of a couple weeks ago of climate change in forests. And there are new sections below that, and I will be developing more material information here and having resources, but a few resources that I created is an overview guide of what is forest carbon, a lot of what I just talked about here, but some in more detail. There is a Vermont carbon inventory that I use data collected by the Forest Service and other folks to look at what's the status of the carbon in our forests in Vermont. How does it compare to our greenhouse gas emissions by state? How much carbon do we harvest in timber harvest, and how much gets emitted in burning, in combustion? And then there also is a document that I created on forest carbon markets for Vermont landowners. So that I didn't really get into carbon markets too much here. It's too complex and there's too many nuances to talk about. But that has some information in it, including information to some of the developers that I mentioned, some of the programs, and some more details about minimum lot size that you would need, contract length, etc. So hopefully that's helpful to you. If not, I am always, as Tim knows, I'm always welcome to get emails, and this is my email address. So feel free to get in touch with me if you have questions or follow up. But I guess I'll open it to live questions at this point now.
Hi, Ali, thanks so much. And as I just pointed out in the chat in response to a question, I will be sending out those links to everyone who registered for this event. So don't worry about if you missed anything on the PowerPoint, you'll get it. But thank you so much, Ali. I'm going to have our director, Michael, hop on as well to help ask some questions. But I think I'm going to skip over that first one, the question about what kind of carbon being weighted or transparent, because it was answered by Michael that gases like carbon dioxide are more diffuse than something like wood, but are made up of molecules which do have weight. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that one, Ali.
I can't really see. Let me see I can't see the question. Hold on, let me open the chat.
So is carbon a transparent thing? Like
yeah, that's a good. Yeah, there was just that's a great question, and yes, that was just for the schematic. But yeah, you can't really see. You couldn't see it in the air. It's all around us. We're made of carbon. Every living organism has carbon, and so you wouldn't be able to see it. It was just a way to visualize because people ask, how does a gas have weight? That seems like a really weird concept, but it does. But you just need a lot of it to have weight.
Great. Did you want to go with the next question, Michael?
Sure. It looks like the next unanswered question here is, Ali, is there a known proportion of carbon in rotting wood that is emitted versus going into the soil C, the letter C, pool?
That's a good question. It really depends on the environmental conditions because decomposition really depends on moisture availability, temperature, also depends on the species and what is actually decomposing it. So a fungus, there's a lot of fungi that actually really go after the carbon heavy lignin. They can decompose that, whereas an insect or some other critter might not be able to decompose that. So really, I don't know if I can answer that in a way that wouldn't be very general. But also one thing that is really interesting is that decomposing wood can also release methane. So it's not only carbon dioxide that gets released. We put everything in those carbon dioxide equivalents, as I said, just to make everything easier. But there are a lot of other greenhouse gases, right, that we release as humans, but also that are just naturally released. And one of those from forests is methane. And so especially when wood is saturated or a forest is flooded, methane can be released. One really interesting thing I've seen as a little bit of a side is I've seen actually a tree release gas that can be lit on fire. So methane is flammable. So there's a tool called a tree core that I use to bore into the side of a tree, and you extract a little like pencil size part of the wood, and that's so you can count the rings and measure the rings. But that also opens the tree up, right? So it creates this conduit. So I haven't done this myself. It happened in a cottonwood tree I saw from someone in southern New England, and they were able to light the gases coming out of that hole on fire. So, trees do produce methane, and that has to do with, microbes in the wood and its decomposition that's happening. But the thing about methane, it's much more of a potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that is something we consider when we're talking about decomposition, is you can have methane released.
That's incredible. I didn't know that was possible.
Yeah.
This is one that did get partially answered, but I did just want to pose it to you. Someone was wondering what silviculture was. You mentioned it, I think, in one of your strategies.
Yeah, so silviculture is the art and science of managing forests. So it doesn't mean just, going in and haphazardly logging, I'm going to take that tree, I'm going to take that tree. It's understanding different types of species, how they grow, how they're, what we call their silvics, which is, how fast do they grow? How do they reproduce? What conditions do they like to live in? And so we use that information and manage the forest accordingly. So you're not just going in and saying, oh, I'm just going to treat every forest the same. If you have a maple beech birch forest versus a hemlock forest versus a spruce fir forest, they have very different silvics even within those species, and you manage them very differently. So that kind of informs what sort of silviculture you would use in those forests.
So another question here is, what is entailed in the ecological study of forests?
A a lot. What sort of things are measured maybe, or?
It's just kind of a global question that what is entailed in the ecological study of forests?
Yeah, I mean, ecology is the interconnectedness amongst things, right? So we're not just, that's why I call myself a forest ecophysiologist. So it's not just looking at a tree as, on its own and it's not connected. We know that it's connected to everything around it, right? It's reliant on, animals maybe to transport seed for it, so the seed can move in different places. Reliant on soil systems for nutrient and water, and also we know that trees interact in the soil. They actually can connect their roots and share resources. There are fungi in the soil that help trees get resources from the soil. So there's all sorts of things that people can say. I mean, forest ecology, I'm biased, but is the coolest, and so there's so many things when we think about the interconnectedness, and also that we are connected to the forest ecology system, right? We're not separate from it. What decisions we make, even if we think that we're leaving a forest alone, it's wilderness, we're still impacting it through acid rain, through air pollution, through climate change. So there's always going to be something that we are part of that system. It's too interconnected to silo.
Great, thank you. We have a question here. What about methane release when biofuel is used to produce electricity?
Yes, there can be some methane release. The best use of biofuels is combined heat and power, right? So electricity, we know using biofuels is not the most efficient use, and certainly there can be other greenhouse gases emitted. Yeah, it's part of it, but really we account for that in those life cycle analyses. They do account for all these other greenhouse gases. Again, they're converted all to carbon dioxide equivalents just because you can't compare them all in the same units, right? So it's really interesting. A metric ton of methane, of gaseous methane, has much more of a global warming potential. So that's like how well it does in heating the atmosphere and trapping heat than CO2. But it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere as CO2. It degrades faster. So there's sort of this issue where we can't really compare apples and oranges. We convert them all to carbon dioxide equivalent, but certainly that's part of these life cycle analyses, and it still is a substitution effect because fossil fuels also have lots of other outputs and air quality issues that they entail.
Okay. Well, this is kind of a related question. The question is increasing sequestration via reduction of deforestation versus increasing LLP seem to be a dichotomy.
Yep. I think the deforestation, I think there was I have to look back at the paper. There was an assumption there about how much was reduced. It's not a 100% because I think that was recognized. It's probably not realistic to say, tomorrow we're going to have no forest loss. There's already probably parcels that are being purchased right now and houses being built, right? We know we're in a housing boom. So I think the deforestation one had a certain number of acres that were not going to be deforested. So that's probably why. I think that's maybe the question, is the increasing LLP was larger of a reduction than the deforestation? Is that what I'm getting with that?
It says increasing sequestration via reduction of deforestation and increase of LLP seem to be a dichotomy. I think it's getting at, when I'm reading the question, it's getting at that if you're cutting the forest to make a furniture, say, versus sequestering carbon by not cutting the forest seem to be.
I see. Yep. So that's that issue of well, it's a combination of things. So forest management isn't, passive management, which is what we call, no management in a forest, does not mean that forest will continue to sequester carbon, into the future. There could be things like disturbances that occur on that parcel. There's also a decline in sequestration as that forest ages. Whereas if you have forest management, you're creating these this age diversity. So you sort of have a mosaic in that area of younger trees that might be sequestering, but also older trees that are storing well. And then that harvesting of that long-lived wood products is we can kind of calculate. We have numbers about how long those products stay in use, and it ends up being, it can often be, you know, a pretty long time, and so you get kind of this cumulative benefit from those products. But yeah, you know, I will say also, modeling is modeling, right? So it is hard. I sort of insinuated it's really hard for us to measure forest carbon, and that's for what's here. And so to model in the future, we have to make a lot of assumptions, and it's a little bit coarse. So we use it as a, you know, kind of understanding what the options are, but not that those numbers are going to be what actually happens in reality. But it helps us give us a sense of, okay, what strategies could we use to have at least, you know, my goal is we maintain sequestration. If we can increase sequestration in the state, that's great, but we want to make sure we can maintain it. Because right now we're having a decline in sequestration, and there's potential if you carry that line through of that decline in the rate of decline in sequestration. You know, there will be a point, if you assume that's a linear trend, that we would have no net sequestration in our forests. I don't think that's going to happen, but we want to think about how we can maintain sequestration. So part of that is having age diversity on the landscape. We don't want all of our forests being one single age or one single condition, but not really sure I totally answered that question.
Great. So this is also related to sequestration. Why does increasing diversity increase carbon sequestration?
Yep, so species diversity, again, it's kind of that different species will fill different niches in the forest. So you can have species like red spruce that's incredibly what we call shade tolerant. It can exist in the understory for, I mean, I've studied red spruce a lot. It can exist as a, you know, 3 foot, 4 foot tall, what we'd call probably a sapling, and it will be 50, 60 years old. It can just persist in that area, and it waits for a tree above it to die or decline, and it capitalizes on that space. So when you have those options, you have fewer dips in sequestration. If you had a situation where, you know, the overstory trees mature and just start dying, you have another cohort, you have various trees occupying different spaces, and so it just gives us more, it's like more biomass in that unit than if you only had, you know, one species. I mean, think about, a good example is like a plantation. I'm sure we all can picture like a pine plantation, right? And you just have kind of one structure there, one story of those trees. There's a lot of other space for trees to occupy in those systems, but there's no trees in those places. So having that structure, that species diversity, both those things we do know that they can be good for carbon as well.
So this is a great question. According to Merlin Sheldrake, decomposing fungi emit 85 gigatons of carbon to the atmosphere every year. How is this incorporated into forest carbon equation?
Whew. Probably not. I mean, I'm a big lover of fungi, and I think they're very underappreciated, first of all, and understudied. So I would imagine that's not incorporated. I don't know that. I would think that the only way that would get incorporated is like in global greenhouse gas emission models. I don't think that it's incorporated. We really have, I will say we have very little data on some of these, you know, for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, so sequestration and emissions for other types of land, like wetlands. We don't know a lot about wetland dynamics. And we have probably the most data about forests, and for soils, we're still learning. We're very at the tip of the iceberg with soils. So yeah, I don't think fungi is something that we've incorporated at all. But the only way that would come up is the way that we do monitor carbon is really from one time step to another. That's how we get carbon flux, is you measure the carbon stocks in a forest in 1 year, you go back a couple years later and you measure them again, and the difference is to how much that forest fluxed. So if it increased in storage, you had sequestration. If it decreased, you had emissions. So that would be the only way that decomposition from fungi would come in. If there was less carbon than in the soil, you would capture that through that inventory.
Okay. Let's see, we have, all right, so the latest word from some climate experts is don't burn wood for energy at all. What do you say?
Yeah, so I will say the biomass debate is very heated. I am not on that side. I think there's many aspects to climate change. You know, there's part about equity and sustainability too, right? So I do think that's really important, is having a local source of energy. Yes, it does release carbon dioxide. So, you know, using wood in the place of solar might not be the best option, but wood in the place of fossil fuels. And it is very important in our climate. We don't have a lot of sustainable energy sources in, you know, December. Solar is pretty limited and wind is pretty limited. And so there is justification there for using bioenergy in those other times. You know, certainly we call hydro a green source here, and we know that hydro comes with a lot of equity issues. Hydro-Quebec has a lot of equity issues with land, that, you know, land ownership, also methane release from reservoirs. So, you know, everything comes with trade-offs. And so I think that's, you know, it's just one of those things of weighing those different trade-offs and where do we lie there. But I think having a local source of energy and heat is incredibly important and valuable.
So this question is, what's a quote pay for practice unquote program?
Yeah, so I meant to talk a little bit more about that, but so the Family Forest Carbon Program has what they call, so one way that they're trying to reduce costs of project development, as I mentioned, the project development for carbon projects is very costly and intensive because there's an inventory that needs to happen. So the way they're getting around this is that they are having folks do practices that we know are carbon beneficial. And then they're verifying the carbon on a set of national inventory plots from, it's a national inventory, but they'll get plots that are proximal to wherever the landowner is. So that's the way they kind of have a control plot to verify. But one of the pay for practices they have is growing mature forests, it's called. And so really that's harvesting less than growth. So as long as your growth is greater than what you're harvesting, leaving, you know, old trees, leaving reserves, lengthening rotation. They're still working out all the details. They have piloted this program in Pennsylvania, and they had 2 different pay for practice strategies, which was growing future forests. And it was also, there was one about regenerating forests too. And they're working here. I haven't heard the final set of practices that will be used here in New England, because it's a little bit different. We have different forests, and trying to figure out how they can give credits, carbon offset credits to those practices. They have to have some sort of way to verify that using that national forest inventory. But I think it simplifies carbon markets for a lot of people, and it's open to think about 40 acres thereabouts and greater.
And just to check, are you okay going for a few more questions, Ali? Do you have to run somewhere?
Sure. No, I'm in my house. Just eat dinner at some point.
Yeah. Okay, we'll do some more. When harvesting wood for long-term carbon storage, are there tree species that are better than others?
There are, although, you know, it really probably comes out to be negligible. But yes, certainly, you know, there are trees just by their physiology, they store more carbon in them than other trees. So it's really those heavier, denser woods that's more carbon. So if you have a piece of wood that's really dense versus something that's really light, like a balsa wood, that's less carbon. So mass of wood is really related to the weight. So yes, certainly, and that actually aligns with a lot of the woods that we use for long-term products. Like thinking about hard maple floors or oak trim or something like that. Those certainly store quite a lot of carbon in them. Softwoods, which we use for structural building, they do store carbon too. And so it's not, I don't know if that should, I don't know if we should go that route of really selecting which species we are thinking from a carbon perspective, because it probably is just more important just to keep carbon in the forest and keep carbon in these harvested wood products for as long as we can.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump down to the next question that a couple of questions were asked and then answered in the chat.
Okay.
This one is, wildlife managers are encouraging landowners to cut forests to create early successional habitat, or what some call young forest habitat, on a 10-year rotation. This practice not only reduces forest biodiversity, but increases forest stressors like increased deer browsing, increased invasive species. What are your thoughts on this? How do landowners make decisions regarding carbon sequestration versus wildlife habitat?
Yeah, that's another really good question. This is one of those trade-offs. So it is hard to manage for everything in one forest. It really is. And you do have to make some sacrifices. So I would say to landowners, figuring out what are your main priorities for harvesting, what are your main priorities in harvesting it, and what are your main priorities on your forest. So if carbon storage and sequestration is really a priority to you, you might think about smaller cuts if you want to also manage for wildlife. They are compatible. They really are. I do know specifically a couple carbon offset projects that have wildlife management components, but it's really about the scale. So you wouldn't want those wildlife cuts to be a large percentage of the forest parcel, because then you are losing carbon. As far as and they are important, that is creating diversity across the landscape is really is critical. And you have, in 10 years and in 20 years, that forest will grow up and you have different stages. So it really does provide resilience. I mean, there's a great example of in New Hampshire, when there was the tornado came through and big old white pines came down, and in places where there was a younger stand of white pines, totally fine, because they were more resilient, springy, and they survived. And so you still have some standing trees in the forest, right? So having a diversity of age class can be really good in case of disturbance, and in this case it can help with wildlife habitat. As far as introducing invasive species, that comes down to planning. I wouldn't do that. You need to be careful in doing that kind of management where there are invasive species, because invasive species will capitalize on those disturbance gaps. So that's not a great solution if you have a lot of invasive species in your forest. Deer browse, that is certainly a huge problem here in Vermont and in a lot of other states in New England. There are a lot of us talking about that in the forestry realm. It's really concerning, actually, because it's not only in these cuts where we see it. In fact, those cuts can actually be helpful for deer browse, because the deer there's so much, they're almost overwhelmed with stems. So there'll be fewer, they won't be able to get to everything. Where we're seeing a really big impact is actually in the forest, where there's not cuts and not openings, where there might be fewer seedlings and saplings. And so when those are eaten, there's nothing left. There are areas in the woods where there's no regeneration because of deer browse or competition from invasive plants or American beach sprouts. That's a big problem. So we're concerned about that. And so whether, talking to your forester on those concerns, I think is important, and laying out what your main goals are for your forest parcel is important as well.
Thank you. I'm going to skip this next one and include it in my follow-up email if you think it's possible, Ali. It's looking any references for sustainable silvopasture in Vermont. Is that one I can do or no?
I'll just say I think it's cool. I think I know there are farmers that do that. I personally do not know where you would get that information. Maybe UVM, actually. I would think UVM might have some resources. It's a cool idea, and I'm all for combining uses. That's great. Keeping forest is forest. It's awesome.
Great, it's an easy one. So I'll just go to the next. What do you tell people who object to carbon offsets by arguing that people might not bother to reduce their own emissions if they believe they can compensate by just buying offsets?
Yeah, it's certainly something that we have to contend with. I mean, we really have to, carbon offsets are what I've heard is, they're a stopgap. What I've heard from a carbon offset developer, if we're using carbon offsets in 50 years, we did something wrong. Really, they're a way for us they're designed to help offset emissions that are hard to offset while those entities are trying to offset emissions. So there should be some effort from the entities to reduce emissions. And I'm talking about like the businesses that are buying them, the airlines, the big companies, they really need to be making efforts to reduce actual emissions. That's where we're going to get the climate benefit from. And so I think that is happening more and more with those companies, that their shareholders are recognizing that they can't just buy offsets and say, we're net zero, that they need to actually do things. And so that's where it really comes from, is consumer pressure, seems like. As far as individuals, I think there's, individuals have been given a lot of, put a lot of pressure on individuals for reducing carbon emissions. The term, carbon footprint was developed, I think by one of the oil companies, I think BP, might have been Exxon. And it really was putting pressure on individuals. And so we recognize now, yes, individual actions are incredibly important, but also we need, like sustained government actions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So, it's sort of, carbon offsets are a little bit in that area right now where there is maybe some misuse of them, but I think in the end, they're serving a really important purpose.
Yeah, so thank you. Do we want to maybe have just one more question? Let Ali get some dinner.
Yeah, really. We're keeping you here.
Okay.
Yeah, what's my husband cooking?
I guess there was a, I know someone seconded that question. It seemed like there was a lot of interest in it. So let's end with, is it Gio's question? Given climate change and warmer temps, should we plan to plant different species now in anticipation of future higher temps?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's an entirely different webinar on climate change impacts and how we can manage for climate change impacts. It's really focusing on that, like carbon mitigation. But yes, favoring what we call future adapted species, whether through planting or just how you manage your forest. I'm doing it here in my woods here. I don't, we have mostly maple beech birch forest, but there are some small oaks coming in, and where those oaks are coming in, so red oak is a future adapted species. It's a little bit more warm loving. It's really adaptable to changing conditions. So where I find red oaks in the forest, I'm making sure that they have space, and I'm leaving them and I'm protecting them. Just so I have that, variety, that species diversity in my forest. So if things change really quickly, I have something that's adapted to future conditions. So there's some great resources by the Forest Service. One in particular I adore is a climate change tree atlas, and you can look at specific tree species here in Vermont and see where they're projected to do well. And it's really a lot of our cold adapted species, so balsam fir in particular, that we find really in cold hollows or up at high elevation. And then some of our warm loving species like our hickories and our oaks that we find more in southern Vermont are really projected to do well. And so certainly that's a great option. There are folks that are experimenting with planting and trying this stuff out. So Tony D'Amato, professor at UVM, is working, he's a silviculturist, and so he's working with doing management in the forest and trying different plantings to see if we can, what result that has and if it can help with forest resilience in climate change. So it's something to, again, that would be a different, different webinar topic.
Well, that's great. It's just a really amazing presentation. There's so many different facets to this. The question about soil fungi decomposition and contributions to climate change or carbon emissions, it made me think about mycorrhizal fungi, which actually enhance, interweave with the roots and penetrate them and enhance tree growth. So they're probably increasing, I would imagine, carbon storage and sequestration by enhancing tree growth. So how does that balance with whatever decomposing fungi might contribute to carbon emissions to the atmosphere? It's so many facets to it, and you did a wonderful job of presenting a really complex subject.
Oh God, I hope so. All right. Well, I'm glad it was helpful, and yeah, nice virtually seeing some folks, and yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. You're getting lots of
Thank you, Ali.
All right, take care, everyone. And I will send I guess I already sent them to you, the resources. If you need them again, let me know.
Yeah, great. I will send that out to everyone with a recording of this. So
Great.
thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for
All right,
joining
bye.
us.
Thank you.